There is a phenomenon in Canada, it's around the world, but it's strongest in Canada, about politicians in opposition saying, elect me, and I am going to cut spending. I am going to cut taxpayers' wastage. I'm going to make the government sound. Jay Goldberg is with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. He joins me right now because I want to put it to you, especially in Ontario, where we have a conservative government, and Doug Ford, in all speeches, say, we are going to just cut taxes and we're going to cut spending. What's happening?
Well, we're not seeing a conservative government. We're seeing a government that's tabled a budget with a record high deficit, almost $20 billion. It's higher.
But that's because of COVID, though, Jay.
The deficit this year is higher than it was during COVID. So it's not just because of COVID. And this premier, the Fraser Institute, put out a study suggesting that Doug Ford has increased spending at a faster rate than Dalton McGuinty or Kathleen Wynne. And so this premier is spending money like a drunken sailor. And he has no plan to balance the books. And on top of that, we haven't seen any significant tax cuts that he promised, such as income tax cuts in 2018. We've seen none of it. So we haven't seen lower taxes. We haven't seen responsible spending. And, you know, he campaigned on that. We haven't seen it.
But, I mean, we just had an election in Ontario, and the rest of the country can look at that as perhaps learn a lesson. And he won again. So what's to be said about this? Should there be a recall?
Well, we should have recall initiatives. We should be able to recall our politicians all across the country. But if you're in an election when you have two or three other parties promising even worse government, then perhaps the current government's not looking quite as bad. That's not necessarily a ringing endorsement of how the government's governed for the last 4 years.
No, that's true. So is this just cyclical? Because in the 70s and 80s, governments, federal governments especially, spent an awful lot of money. And then in the 90s, they had to just clamp down. They said, we have no more money to spend, we have no more money to borrow. So are you anticipating that in 2 or 3 years, when the federal government, provincial governments cannot borrow any more money, somebody's going to have to come in and say, okay, we're going to clean up this mess? Look,
Justin Trudeau has doubled the federal debt. The debt here in Ontario is a record high, well over $400 billion. We're spending $13 billion on interest payments here in Ontario. We are almost at that point where we are not going to be able to afford to pay our bills. And that's why we need to change our attitudes now. We need to be more fiscally responsible now so that we don't have to see what happened in the 1990s where in Saskatchewan they closed 50 hospitals. We don't want to see things like that, and so we have to take action now.
We have to stop the gravy train.
We have to stop the gravy train.
Jay Goldberg. I was chuckling at it, but it's no laughing matter. It's serious. We're in trouble in this country.
We got to end the gravy train.
Thanks very much. 3 minutes. If you did not know that the red ensign, formerly Canada's flag, has now been labeled by the Canadian government a symbol of hate, and they're sending that to all the students, then press subscribe and PayPal and learn more.